comes to the U.S. military action, President Trump made some big moves in the last 2 weeks, and he got bipartisan support from South Florida lawmakers, although they do say he must get authorization from Congress before he does anything more militarily.
South Florida Congressman Carlos Curbelo, a Republican, and Ted Deutch, a Democrat, joined us in the studio Friday to talk about that and a lot more, including one of South Florida's biggest issues, health insurance.
Congressman, we all know the world has always been a dangerous place, but in the last week or two, it seems to have grown exponentially more dangerous. We have Tomahawk missiles going into Syria. We explode a Moab, this huge bomb in Afghanistan, and Kim Jong-un is making angry sounds in North Korea. Congressman Deutch, what do you make of this, and is the world more dangerous?
Well, the world has always been dangerous, and the use by Assad of chemical weapons that prompted the response by the administration just reminds us of the Civil War, in which he's killed over 400,000 of his own people. And when you look at that attack, the missile attack in Syria in response to the chemical attack, and the dropping of this massive bomb on ISIS in Afghanistan, and the concerns about North Korea, you realize Congress has been left out, and Congress has a responsibility, I think soon. I think we ought to be back in session next week to debate an authorization to use military force so that it's clear not just what the president's goals are militarily, but what limits, what constraints Congress should be placing upon him. Right. We should be doing that on behalf of the American people.
You're still working off the authorization from 9/11.
Right.
I mean, that's the last time Congress weighed in.
And Michael, I agree. I'm a co-sponsor to an authorization of use for military force specifically to address the Islamic State, ISIS, and I think we should also authorize the use of force in Syria. I think a lot of Republicans and Democrats came together last week to say, yes, we agree. Assad cannot proceed with impunity. For years, he's been gassing innocent people to death, children. That cannot be allowed to happen in the year 2017 in what we would like to think of as a civilized world. I think the Congress just needs to make it official that we are at war with the Islamic State and that we need to win that war, and also that we're not going to tolerate Bashar al-Assad or really any UN-recognized leader to gas innocent people to death.
But wouldn't there need to be, though, before, when Congress authorizes a policy, what is the policy? Because the airstrikes on Syria seem to be a gut reaction to what the president saw, the babies. And right now, as Ileana Ros-Lehtinen and I had a conversation, and she supports the use of force, but says that there is no appetite in the U.S. right now for another war. Would you support that?
I think she's right. She's absolutely right. And what's been missing here is, as you point out, a discussion about the president's policy here. It's not clear at all, other than, in this case, the fact that he saw the same horrific images that we all saw, and that prompted this military strike. It's not clear what the policy is, what the goal is. Congress has to come together to agree on not just the need to take action to defeat ISIS, but on what limitations we need to have in place so that we don't find ourselves in another ground war in the Middle East.
But I will say, Glenna, the President of the United States, no President of the United States, needs to seek authorization to respond to world emergencies. I would argue that what we saw in Syria was a world emergency. I think President Obama should have done what President Trump did 4 years ago. If there's going to be an extended campaign, absolutely, presidents have to go to Congress. But chemical weapons were used in a country where U.S. troops are present. Innocent people, including children, were gassed to death. An immediate response was required. I am glad that the administration didn't dither and wait, as the previous administration did in 2013, arguing that they needed to seek authorization from Congress when they didn't for that immediate first response.
Would you support regime change and using force for regime change?
I believe that the United States position should be that Bashar al-Assad has no future in Syria.
Now,
does that mean that we invade Syria? Does that mean that we are going to launch a campaign a military campaign to remove him? No, but it means that we continue pressuring our allies, the rest of the world, through sanctions to remove Assad from power. He is the most evil person in the world right now. He is the greatest terrorist in the world right now, and he should not be leading any country.
When Assad, I would just say that when Assad killed close to 1,500 people, when he gassed close to 1,500 people 4 years ago, as someone who strongly believed that there should have been a response then, the president came to Congress, and I couldn't find a majority of my Republican colleagues or Democratic colleagues to support the effort, though I thought it would have been appropriate, and I think it's appropriate now. But what we can't have is a situation where the president is making foreign policy decisions based on the latest segment on Fox News. That's not in the best interest of our country.
Right. Well, vis-a-vis of what Congressman Curbelo just said, this week we all know Rex Tillerson was in Moscow. He sat down for a couple of hours of Vladimir Putin, and presumably one of the things he said was, you have to withdraw your support of Bashar al-Assad, and Putin apparently said, oh, no, I'm not going to do that. So without Russia changing its position, I mean, what leverage do we have to move in or to take Assad out?
I hope this administration finally understands that we cannot count on the Russians. It's actually kind of unfortunate. We've had now 3 presidents in a row in this country believe that Vladimir Putin can somehow be trusted. President Bush at one point said that he looked into his soul and he could trust him. President Obama outsourced the Syria situation to Vladimir Putin. That hasn't worked out. And this administration, President Trump, during the campaign said that he thought we could work with Russia. Right. The Russians are not our friends. We need to put pressure on them to do the right thing. We can never just trust them.
Russia has stood by, not only just stood by, they've enabled Assad to slaughter hundreds of thousands of his own people, even as Iran has expanded its influence in Syria and Hezbollah has expanded its influence on the ground. We can't, I agree, we can't rely on Russia, but we have to be firm with Russia. And I will say that after months and months of statements from first candidate Trump and then President Trump about why it's so important for us to have a great relationship with Russia, I think there's finally a realization, as Carlos points out, that it's not about a relationship, that we have to recognize who we're dealing with in Putin and we have to behave accordingly.
Well, I think the administration sent a very strong message by dropping this 21,000-pound, the most powerful non-nuclear weapon in our arsenal in Afghanistan. I mean, it did send a message to Islamic State and killed maybe 3 dozen of their fighters, but it sent a stronger message to people like Kim Jong-un in North Korea.
Look, I do believe in peace through strength, Michael, and of course we have to be measured, and we don't want to launch new wars because that's just not the way to do things in the world. However, we do need to send a strong message that groups like ISIS are not going to be able to proceed with impunity. ISIS has been operating in the Kandahar province in Afghanistan for a long time now. I visited Afghanistan at the beginning of last year, and the generals there were very concerned. And I do support the sending of these strong and clear messages that the United States is going to lead in the world in a smart way, in a restrained way, but that we are not going to simply sit back and watch as the world burns.
Nor will we send American troops into another long ground war in the Middle East. That's what we're balancing here. Yes, it's important that we stand up and we fight ISIS and we do everything we can to keep our country safe, but it doesn't mean getting embroiled in another long ground war, which the American people, I'm quite confident, have no interest in pursuing.
The polls indicate that, certainly. All right, everybody hold your thoughts, Congressman. We will be back with Ted Deutch and Carlos Curbelo in just a minute. Welcome back. In our studio this morning are Congressman Carlos Curbelo of Southwest Miami-Dade and Representative Ted Deutch from Boca Raton. His district stretches from South Palm Beach County all the way down to Fort Lauderdale. Congressman Deutch, you issued a strong statement this week condemning Sean Spicer, the White House press secretary, after he said during a press briefing that Hitler had not gassed his own people, and that he wasn't, in that respect, as bad as Assad. But of course, he ignored completely the history of the Holocaust. He said later, "I'm sorry, but this was a gaffe, a monumental mistake."
It showed such an incredible lack of understanding of world history. It showed such disrespect for what happened in the Holocaust. And it had happened at a time when Holocaust survivors and other Jews were coming together to celebrate Passover. It really was stunning. What's so upsetting about the kinds of statements like that from Sean Spicer is the unwillingness to simply apologize. Remember, Sean Spicer was criticized in response to criticism from me and others on International Holocaust Remembrance Day,
for
when
not mentioning
their
Jews.
statement didn't mention Jews, which was outrageous. His response then was to call those of us who were critical of that omission pathetic. Well, it was pathetic to see him make the statement about Hitler. It was equally troubling for him to then go on and acknowledge, well, no, there were these Holocaust centers where Hitler brought. They were concentration camps where Hitler brought Jews, 6 million Jews that the Nazis killed and slaughtered. And I don't understand how it is that he can make gaffes like that. I'd say one last thing, though. This administration, unfortunately, has not responded well whenever it's been suggested that there are things that are said or unsaid that seem to play into the hands of white supremacists and extremists. That's concerning. Just yesterday, we learned that the White House intends to close up the office of the special envoy, the State Department special envoy, to fight anti-Semitism. All of that in a row just raises really profound concerns, and it's troubling and it's unacceptable, frankly.
This week, spring break, Congressman, a lot of your counterparts are holding town hall meetings and once again taking a beating over the Affordable Health Care Act and people who are just so worried about what's going to happen. So putting aside the past couple of months and going forward, what is going to happen? Where is national health care going? And Congressman Curbelo, you have a lot of constituents in your district, I think you both do, who rely on the Affordable Care Act and wonder what's going to happen. Is it in a death spiral? What comes next?
Well, in terms of what's going to happen in Congress, I think that's still an open question. Speaker Ryan in the House continues to try to build consensus among House Republicans, and that has been elusive up to this point. My view is the following. I think we can do a lot better than our current health care system. So what I think we should do is keep the good in the ACA, make sure we continue covering people with pre-existing conditions, let young people stay on their parents' plans, prohibit the gender rating, meaning we don't discriminate against women in issuing health insurance policies, and eliminating lifetime caps, meaning there's no cap on how much we spend on any individual's health care. So keep all of that and then reform the system so that it works better. The current system is failing in many ways. I'll give you an example. Monroe County in my district, there's only one insurance provider left there. Every year we see that the insurance companies either leave the markets or file for higher premiums. So how can we introduce a market element into the healthcare system, empower consumers so that they can take control of their own healthcare and become the government's allies, and really all of our allies, in actually reducing or containing the cost of healthcare? That is the solution that we're in search of. We have this idea of providing people with tax credits, opposed to the ACA, which essentially threatens people into buying health insurance with government penalties and fees. The tax credit seeks to empower the consumer and say, here, take these funds and go out into the market and buy the health insurance that's best for you and for your family. I think that's a worthwhile idea. That's what the AHCA is premised upon.
But to do this, don't you need to bring in the Democrats? Shouldn't this be a bipartisan process?
Well, I've made clear.
You think so?
I am more than I am ready, willing, and able to sit down to talk about exactly this issue. How do we provide more competition? How do we ensure that there are more providers so that we can cover more people and bring down costs? That's what we ought to be doing. Instead, the piece of legislation, this Trump Care bill that almost came to the House floor but didn't because it would have failed miserably, went exactly the opposite direction. It would have meant that 24 million people would have lost insurance. It would have meant that the basic essential benefits in the Affordable Care Act would have gone away. Maternity care and pediatric care and emergency room care would have been wiped away. And the idea that we're now looking at a proposal that, the latest proposal, at least as I've read about it, suggests that the bar on pre-existing conditions is going to go away as well. Changing the Affordable Care Act to kick millions of people off of their health insurance and to drive up costs and to raise prices by putting in this age tax, which the last bill would have done, is the wrong direction. It's a huge step backward in healthcare, and I don't understand why we're not able to come together to acknowledge that the Affordable Care Act has been successful and then build upon it.
I'll add briefly, the bill needed work. I was involved in many negotiations and discussions to strengthen that tax credit to make sure more people got covered. But what we need to do, Michael, Glenna, is make sure that people not only have health insurance, but that health insurance actually gives them access to health care. There are a lot of people today who check the box, have health insurance, and not pay the government fine, yet when they have to go have surgery, their deductible is $5,000, $6,000, and they really don't have health care.
I would agree with Carlos that it is about ensuring that the insurance policy that someone buys actually insures them when they get sick. It's about making sure that there is basic coverage for everyone. And my hope is that if in order to attract the Freedom Caucus, the Tea Party wing of the Republican Party, it means doing away with all of the essential health benefits that are now part of every policy because of the Affordable Care Act. That Carlos
many
will
of us
oppose
won't
that.
support that.
Right. I'm thrilled to hear
let me
that.
jump in here, Congressman Curbelo. The White House is sending mixed signals on all kinds of issues, including on health care. On Monday, Health and Human Services said, we are going to continue the subsidies to the millions of poor Americans who would not have any policy without the subsidies. And then on Thursday, President Trump in an interview said, no, I'm going to end those subsidies to force the Democrats to come to the table. I don't think that's going to force you to come to the table to negotiate, is it?
I'm glad you brought that up. Think about that proposal from the President of the United States. In order to advance what he believes is in his political interest, he has made clear that the way that he thinks that he needs to do that is to cut health care out from under the most vulnerable Americans. Is that going to cause me to act? It is. It's going to cause me to stand up and defend the Affordable Care Act and the coverage that it provides to people. It's not going to get me to go along with this dangerous proposal.
But that's not something that you can live with either.
Not at all, and many Republicans are already on the record supporting funding for cost-sharing reductions, which is what we're talking about here, the support for the lowest income Americans on deductibles, on premiums, so that they can have access to health care.
Well, gentlemen,
thank you.
Great to have you come in, and we wish you happy Passover, happy Easter,
and holiday weekend,
and a great holiday weekend.
And next we